Welcome, everyone. I'm Steve Johnson. This is Digital Works TV, the Datazone, and we're doing part two of our interview, our podcast with Claus Martel, a retired historian for the Army Materiel Command at Redstone Arsenal. And we are talking about the history of Redstone Arsenal. Okay, the first time we talked, we went past Sputnik and Explorer 1, but we're going to kind of start there. So a little bit of repetition from the very end of our last podcast. But it's so important for things that happen at Redstone Arsenal in the coming decade to do that. So the Russians launched Sputnik, scared the heck out of the United States. I mean, the headlines in the New York Times, they're up there and we're not. That's kind of how it went.
Well, yeah, and it scared actually the entire free Western world, every free nation, because they did not know, and that's the interesting thing, they did not know what the signal meant.
It was just a beep.
But that's all it was. It was just, which was a fantastic accomplishment. And what's so interesting, talking to the German rocket scientists afterwards, they applauded what the Russians had done. They applauded their accomplishment. But there were so many, I talked to Ernst Stuhlinger, one of von Braun's deputies, and he was at a conference, and it was not a secret that they were going to put up Sputnik. Now, the world knows it now as a big secret, but it was not a secret. Everybody knew it was coming.
Well, in the community, but the general public, which probably wasn't paying close attention.
Right. And as you alluded to, I think last time, the von Braun team and the Army team led by von Braun, they had demonstrated that they could put up a satellite back in 1955. So we're talking about October of 57, but it was almost 2 years before that we could have put up a satellite. And we were told, the Army was told by the White House, you will not put up anything into space. This is not part of the plan.
It was interesting because twice when I interviewed Stuhlinger, this is a great guy, but I interviewed him a couple of times, and he brought it up. We could have been first. He just wanted to make sure everybody understood. We could have been first, but we weren't.
Yeah.
But you have Sputnik, and there had to be a response. America had to put a satellite into orbit to show that we could. To say this was Cold War time. We had to compete. So what happens after? What happens?
Well, after the first Sputnik went up, Eisenhower was called out by the media. He did a press conference and was called out, and he said, "What are we going to do?" And it's so fascinating when you watch the clip to that press conference, because he just stammers and stutters, and he wasn't quite sure how to respond. In the meantime, a month later, the Soviets put up Sputnik 2. So now they've demonstrated that they could put up a live mammal into space, so only a precursor to putting up a human into space. So that was a real big deal. Yeah. But it was after the second Sputnik that the Army here at Redstone was told, okay, go ahead, and, prepare the satellite. What was unknown to many people was the von Braun team, under the leadership of General Medeiros, they already had these modified Redstones, what were called the Jupiter C. They already had these in the warehouse, ready to go. It didn't. That's why it took very little time.
It was from saying you've got the job to launch was what, 90 days?
90 days, yeah. On November the 8th, 57.
Am I correct that Explorer wasn't just beeping; it actually did some things?
Right. So we worked with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, and we worked with I think it was Iowa State or University of Iowa, and that's where Dr. James Van Allen worked. That's right. And it was Van Allen's group who developed the telemetry, the scientific stuff on the actual Explorer 1 satellite, which only stood about maybe 6 foot tall. The whole
And
satellite.
it wasn't even all that heavy, was it?
No, it
'Cause
was not.
And of course, it could have been a mock-up. And I know I've seen something with guys holding it up.
Right. Yeah. Well, and that was the mock-up of it, and there were a bunch of mock-ups. But no, it was not very heavy at all. But the Jupiter C was very, very capable. Like I said, this is not your typical Redstone. This was a heavily modified.
Okay, so and let's just
Redstone.
mention for anybody who may not know, the Redstone was a ballistic missile.
Right.
It was designed. It was a Cold War ballistic missile. It was designed to carry nuclear warheads
Right.
if need be.
It was.
Correct. And so it was a modified Redstone, Jupiter C, that was essentially, it was a response to I won't call it provocation, but it was a Cold War competitive thing. But it was it wasn't it was the Redstone. The first firing of the Redstone was not in anger.
No.
It was.
No, yeah, because Redstone was, again, backing up a little bit, Redstone was the first thing that the German rocket team developed in very, very quick order. They would do a static test, and here's something people ask me all the time. How many missiles were actually flown out of Redstone? 0. Everything was static tested and then taken down off the historic Redstone test stand, put into an Air Force cargo plane, flown down to the Cape, where we at Redstone, we owned the launch.
I want to say there is a sign, and I've seen it, or there was a sign that said Cape, something like a Cape Canaveral Missile Range, managed by Redstone Arsenal or something like that.
Right. Well, actually, the sign said the Army Ballistic Missile Agency missile range.
It said something like that.
But it was our missile range. In fact, the blockhouse that we built for that and for some other launches still stands as a museum right now down at the Cape. But so we had everything ready to go.
Okay.
But before we launched Explorer 1, Eisenhower still wanted to try one more thing that was not related to the Army or the German rocket team, and that was Vanguard, the Navy-developed Vanguard. And we have the interviews where everybody said, this was not a tried, true, proven system. Redstone was. That's why its nickname was Old Reliable. But in early December 1957, a month after Sputnik 2, which put up the dog Laika, they tried to launch a satellite with Vanguard, and it very famously exploded on live TV.
In fact, it would be worth people's while to Google the Vanguard. I mean, it's the worst rocket disaster as far as just on the pad, falling apart, going up in flames. And was it live? I think it was live television.
It was.
Wasn't it?
Right. Yeah. And that because that was going to be our big response.
Yeah.
And it failed infamously. And so just 6 weeks or 7 weeks later, the historic significance of Explorer 1 is that it was developed here, was built here. We're talking about everything but the satellite. The satellite was, like I said, developed by University of Iowa. The propulsion system for the satellite, once it got, technically the third stage, was developed by the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, which we actually ran. The Army ran that. Yeah. And so when NASA took over the JPL. But it was tested here before we flew down to the Cape. It worked. Everything worked great. And then we put it into an Air Force cargo plane, flew down to the Cape. And I believe we had tried for a January 30th launch for Explorer 1, and we had to wait because of weather. And then Explorer 1 actually went up, I think it was 10:30 at night on January 31st. And then what's so cool about that was that once word got back that the satellite was actually in space working, that was relayed via telegram to Huntsville, and then in downtown Huntsville, they had this huge
on the steps of the courthouse
around the whole square. People set off bottle rockets. They had, and we've interviewed people who actually were there at the celebration.
Yeah. So, and it was a big deal, and something to remember. America got into space. The Army started America's space program,
right?
Which I think the Army is justifiably proud of that. And not only that, but the Army at Redstone Arsenal did it.
Yeah, and the other important thing to remember about Explorer 1, that Sputnik 1 was just had a homing beacon. Sputnik 2, which put up a door Laika.
Yeah, which, by the way, horribly, Laika was just left to die.
And I read something recently where they think she died within an hour. But there was, whatever oxygen was on board,
probably,
and then she perished.
Yeah,
but the Explorer 1 was a true, because remember, this is again more background. This is part of the International Geographic Year (IGY), which was a big deal, and it discovered the Van Allen radiation belts. Yeah. So it
which you probably got in your high school science classes,
right? Yeah. So it's not. We were late in terms of putting up a satellite. I'm doing air quotes, but we were the first ones to actually put up a satellite that actually had a scientific, non-military purpose to it.
Okay, I want to talk just a little bit about General Medeiros, and is one of those, like we mentioned last time, like Holger Toftoy, who was part of Operation Paperclip for not only bringing the German rocket scientists to the U.S., but getting them to Redstone Arsenal.
Correct.
But General Medeiros was in charge during the Sputnik Explorer time, and he was a pivotal figure, I think. And
yeah, Medeiros did something that was really trailblazing at the time. One of the first things he did was he built a movie laboratory, a movie studio, right next to his headquarters building. So building 4488 was the headquarters building, and he built right next door building 4489, which was a movie lab. And Medeiros understood the power of the media, understood that if you produced films to show the American public what was going on, because remember, the military, just like we are now, very secretive, we don't show our hand. But Medeiros wanted to get, he had produced literally hundreds of these public service announcement type films to show what the Army was doing and how we were progressing. And he never hesitated to get in front of the cameras. Medeiros went on Meet the Press twice. Yeah. This is a 2-star general, and anybody who knows the military ranks, 2-star general is like, so what? Not a national.
They're not really going on television even these days.
But Medeiros got in front of the media. Von Braun got in front of the media. Yeah. Von Braun did a whole series with Disney to show what the possibilities were and what we were working on. Toftoy was on the media. He was interviewed by Mike Wallace for a special on CBS called Race for Space. Yeah. Edward R. Murrow came to Redstone.
And there's the famous interview with Von Braun, am I correct, in the blockhouse out in front of the historic, as you said, Redstone test stand.
Yeah, he was explained to Edward R. Murrow for another special for CBS called The Biography of a Missile, which was an hour-long thing where Edward R. Murrow showed everything about how rockets work. Yeah, he had Von Braun show him on a chalkboard how rockets and missiles work and the basic principles of it. Yeah. And then Von Braun, we have an interview with him. This is a little bit later in the 60s, where von Braun went on German television, and one of those rare instances of von Braun speaking German, because his infam, as you mentioned when we did our last interview, he one of the things von Braun, one of the ground rule number one was we don't speak German at work ever. That was a big no-no.
There were, and it's obvious, once again, this wasn't all that long after the end of World War II.
Right.
And so for some people, I would expect that the memories were, the feelings were raw about the whole thing. Okay, so let's get from there to the Army starts the space program. In 1958, NASA was created, but the place where the space program started didn't exactly join right away. It was still a couple of years.
Right. And so we launched Explorer 2, which failed.
Yeah.
But then we put up Explorer 3, which was successful, and again another big first for Redstone. That was I believe in March of '57, and then we were starting to demonstrate. We had modified the Jupiter into something called the Juno 2, where we put up where we showed we could actually go to the moon with a vehicle like that. And so by that time, we were number one in space. We were it. And then President Eisenhower thought it was best long term, and I think he made the right decision, that our scientific friendly space program should not be in the hands of the military. It should be in the hands of the Army.
Yeah.
And so in the fall of 1958, the decision was made to create a civilian space agency. It wasn't until 1959 when we knew that we were on Redstone, we were going to have to split up our scientific team. And they took, ultimately on 1 July 1960, they took 4,800 government employees. We're not talking about the contractors. We had a lot of contractors working
Isn't
here.
it's famously everybody went out and had a ceremony.
In front of 4488.
And ceremony ended, and half of them went back into NASA, and half of them went back into the Army command.
Right. And that gutted the Army.
And they also, not only that, but a lot of the facilities at Redstone that had been Army facilities became NASA facilities.
Right. And so if you go to Redstone right now and go through the area that NASA occupies, you'll see these high bay buildings. All those were built during the Army time. Now, NASA, over the last 2 decades, have been slowly demolishing these old buildings that were built 70 years ago and building new buildings, new facilities. But it was that was such a big pivotal moment when NASA was created on 1 July 1960.
Okay, so NASA's created, but the Army's still busy at Redstone Arsenal. Von Braun is gone to NASA, but there were some of the German rocket teams stayed with the Army, and of course, when we say German rocket team, there were many people of non-Germanic descent who are Americans who worked, engineers who worked for the Army and for Marshall Space Flight Center.
Yeah. So one of the things we haven't talked about yet was one of the things the Germans. This is a German thing in terms of mentorship, in terms of bringing in apprentices. And so in the 1950s, they set up something called the 9330th Technical Service Unit. And what they did was, we had an active draft all throughout the 1950s. Actually, the draft didn't end until 1974. But we would draft. They were drafting electrical engineers, structural engineers, all these different engineers, and bringing them here and mentoring them under the different elements of the rocket team. Now, when we say German rocket team, there were, of course, many Americans.
Oh, yeah, it was
working
just
here at
it was a rocket team led by the seed group, the Germans,
Right.
The German team from.
But the
came to the
9330th,
US, yeah.
these people, we in fact we did a presentation and we recorded one of their reunions back in 2004 or 2005, when these people were all in their 80s, and most of them sadly have passed on. But some of them went on to be the head of the Marshall Space Flight Center, which is absolutely fascinating. But so many of them went on to long industrial careers. In fact, not just with the government, but also with various different contractors to support NASA and the Army.
Okay, so let's talk about what does the Army do after it splits off? The Army at Redstone had been in the missile business before it got into space business, and I'm assuming that this missile business was continuing at the same time anyway.
Right, and so during this time of Explorer 1, right, the big successes in space, but we were still working very, very hard on developing tactical systems and systems for the field. So you have the Little John, Honest John, development had started on the Pershing. We're talking about later, and then right now at Redstone and in this community, the missile defense business is huge, headed up by the Missile Defense Agency. But the Army, under Medeiros' tutelage, had started working on ballistic missile defense. They had modified the Nike Hercules, and then they started developing, and it's so interesting watching this interview on Meet the Press with Medeiros, they started talking about the Nike Zeus. And Nike Zeus was something that would go into space to knock out a incoming Soviet re-entry vehicle. But back then, the way they had developed it was to take a missile, take it into space, and then detonate a nuclear missile to take out the nukes. And it wasn't until the 1970s that they started developing what they call kinetic kill, meaning that hitting literally a bullet on bullet. And the Army here at Redstone started developing that. But in terms of, the Army, so when NASA was split off, and so Von Braun's working primarily on the Saturn V development of the Saturn.
The NASA was heading that direction.
Put
us on the moon.
But we were working on what they called the Pershing, which was to replace the Redstone. Redstone was officially retired in 1964, and the Pershing was a system using solid fuel. Meaning that you could deploy it somewhere, and because the problem with the Redstone was you had to, in order to launch it, you had to fuel it up, which took a lot of time. It took a lot of logistics. Well, the Pershing was totally different. The Pershing was solid fuel. You could deploy it anywhere. And then when we get to the 1980s, just 25 years later, or 24 years later, we had developed the Pershing 2, which was deployed into in Germany, and which led the Soviets to come to the negotiating table to come up with.
So the Pershing developed at Redstone Arsenal. I mean, this has been said before. It's the missile that won the Cold War. Is that something people have said?
Oh yeah. In fact, I believe he's still alive. Brigadier General retired Bill Fiorentino, who, when he retired, he and his wife, his late wife, set up a horse farm in Madison, which still exists, I think. But he was the project manager for the Pershing 2.
My dad worked on the Pershing, and so I feel like, I've always felt like, well, I'm kind of part of that because my father was.
But the Pershing, Pershing was a big deal. it led to the Cold War, which I think we talked about last time. We actually had Soviet inspectors flying into the Redstone airfield.
And for most people have not traveled on that part of Redstone Arsenal, but there are fields of igloos
in the far south end
far
of the
south,
post.
Am I correct that the Russian inspectors or the Soviet inspectors had to be able to look into each of those igloos? Because we were doing the same thing. We were going and inspecting their facilities in Russia.
And they knew that we did not. We're not. Now we had, in fact, at the far south end of post still exists this huge test stand, which very, very few people have seen, which would do a static test on the Pershing.
Yeah,
on the Pershing 1 and the Pershing 2. Well, actually, they had a Pershing 1, Pershing 1A.
So this is a non-NASA test stand.
That's correct.
We're
at the far south end of the post, on a cliff overlooking the Tennessee River.
Oh, okay. There are
very few people.
I've never seen it. That kind of bothers me.
No, but the only way to get in there, we were, when I was still working for my mentor, Mike Baker, somebody said, well, we got some pictures that we think we'd be interested in. And you had to get special access to go to that. Still today, special access to get down there. And I don't know whether they finally have torn down that old Pershing test stand, but it had rusted.
Okay, so
and some other systems that were developed during that time, which would play a pivotal role in Gulf War #1, Gulf War #2. We started developing, while Von Braun's working on the Saturn, we started developing the TOW, the tube-launched optically tracked wire-guided missile, which is still in the inventory today after 60 years.
And one thing that one of the things Redstone Arsenal, one of the functions of Redstone through the Army Materiel Command and the Security and Assistance Command is supply weapons to allies and strategic partners. And a lot of the missiles the programs are headquartered at Redstone end up being used by allies.
Correct.
And the TOW, am I right, was one of those?
Oh yeah, the TOW, the Hellfire was developed here. So when we talk about the 60s, TOW, Hellfire, they started work on what would become known as the Patriot, and the Patriots are still very much in use. Also, Redstone was instrumental in developing something called the MLRS, the Multiple Launch Rocket System, which then they modified the MLRS into something called the Army TACMS, which is a variation of the MLRS.
And that last thing has been the Ukraine has used
Army
those.
TACMS, yeah.
And one of the things with the MLRS, which changed while I was doing stories out there, was the fact that it carried, at first it carried just submunitions, so it would drop a bunch of bomblets and things like that. But then the international rules of war changed, and because you didn't want 3 years later a kid stepping on a landmine, so that part of it changed, and that's it became something. So you had to control whatever it was you were going to drop from your multiple rocket launch system.
Right, and so we used it infamously during the first Gulf War. Yeah. The Iraqis called MLRS Steel Rain, because what it would do, it would send out shrapnel, which would absolutely shred everything in its wake. Yeah, it would tear through tanks and vehicles, and the Iraqis during the first Gulf War nicknamed it Steel Rain.
Okay, so we have Redstone Arsenal continues right along being part of our both offensive and defensive missile systems.
Right, and the big thing right now is missile defense.
Yeah. And
I'm not even sure of all the different systems that they're now working on. But we know it's in terms of developing and deploying these systems, in case there's an accidental launch from China or Russia or North Korea. But missile defense is a big element. And what's so surprising, Steve, is that we're still managing and systems like TOW, Hellfire, the Javelin. We meant to mention that Javelin's been under development. They started developing that over 40 years ago.
Yeah, and it still gets tested constantly.
We have test ranges at the south end of Post where we still will, for quality purposes, we'll take one of those out of the inventory and launch them. But Javelin was also a weapon that we have used extensively for the First Gulf War, Second Gulf War, and also provided javelins to the Ukrainians.
Yeah. Well, and that is one of the functions of Redstone Arsenal. Once again, the allies and strategic partners. So Ukraine would be one of those, and so Redstone Arsenal still to this day, if there's military equipment going to Ukraine, there are Redstone hands and eyes on that transaction.
Right.
So, that's, I'm not sure everybody is aware of that.
Yeah, and getting back when you mentioned the Security Assistance Command, when BRAC, the Base Realignment and Closure Commission.
Could just before you say that, could we drop back to the BRAC that took some things away from here, but brought the Army Materiel Command? Because one thing about Redstone Arsenal, it probably, I would expect, has the fewest actual uniformed military people now than it's ever had.
Correct. Right. So when we talked in part one, we talked about the creation. Again, talking about that element of mentorship that the Von Braun team bought in. And so before we developed anything, we had set up a missile school to train soldiers on how to maintain and operate these various systems. And that school was in existence from the early 1950s until 2010. And you mentioned the BRAC that bought AMC down. In BRAC 2005, they decided to move, and that school had moved away from a missile school because we used to train soldiers how to maintain the Pershing and the Redstone and all these other missile systems. Hawk was a big thing.
Yeah.
I don't know whether I mentioned Hawk in terms of development.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of missiles,
a lot of systems, but the school started getting away from that in the 1990s and into the early 2000s, and that's when the FBI presence starts coming in, because the FBI starts working with these soldiers on how to deal with improvised explosive devices. And hence you have the development of the FBI's training facility at far south end of Post, the Hazardous Devices School, which trained not just FBI personnel, but also personnel from law enforcement agencies from all over. What's so interesting about that period of time in the 1990s and 2000s is Mike Baker and I, we were working in the Sparkman Center, and they would, all these law enforcement people from all over the country, all had they had little badges on, where they were working from, Washington State and Iowa, North Dakota, Michigan. And it was so interesting talking to these people, asking them where they're from, how long they've been down here. And they were just so amazed at how, all the stuff going on at Redstone.
And there was the, I'm not being able to think of it. There was a school there to teach people who neutralize explosive devices. Before FBI, there was an Army school there.
Right, and that was still part of that. When we talk about the missile school.
Okay, it's part of the missile school. What was that called? Remind me.
It had a bunch of different names. The Ordnance Missile Munitions,
yeah.
and then they changed it to Ordnance Missile Electronics School.
Oh, is it OMEMS? Is that
OMEMS,
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Anyway, so BRAC 2005 happens, and they said, okay, well, the missile school has to go to Fort Lee, but we were gaining, and by that time, because you mentioned how many soldiers were on Redstone. We had so many soldiers on Redstone.
Yeah.
From the 50s,
they had
60s, 70s,
drill
80s.
instructors. They marched and
Right, and we also had a very large contingent of the German Air Force here.
yeah.
They had set up, in fact, a restaurant that was so famous that they, were.
Yeah. No, yeah, and one of the things, and there were liaison officers. I mean, like I was friends with a guy who was a colonel, a German, who was here as a liaison with between the German military and what was going on at Redstone Arsenal.
Now, interestingly enough, there are still those liaison officers,
Yeah.
offices here. I just did a post tour and briefing for the German Patriot missile office, which is a very large office. We have it here at Redstone. But anyway, so 2005, they made the announcement the school is going to go away, but we're going to gain AMC, and one of AMC's subordinate commands, which was the command that is the conduit between the State Department and foreign military.
Security and assistance.
Security assistance.
And then there's the contracted command, which works on all the deals between the U.S.
Right.
and
So
allies and
each
strategic
of
partners.
the Army Material Command's major subordinate commands, so some of them are the Tank and Automotive Command up in Warren, Michigan. We had the Electronics Command in Fort Monmouth, and that got moved to Maryland somewhere now. I can't remember. But we had all these subordinate commands, and they all had their own contracting elements. Well, AMC combined all those contracting elements to something called the Army Contracting Command.
Yeah, it's just I'm sitting here and I'm thinking it was so much simpler to talk about Redstone when we did one or two things.
Right, when it was
now-
just the Army and NASA.
Well, now it's the Army has the Army and/or related things, the Space Missile Defense Command, the
the Missile Defense Agency. Just for those who don't know, this is what they call a purple command, and a purple command means that it is jointly operated by the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, and so the commanding officer, which is a 3-star officer, rotates between the Army, an Army 3-star, an Air Force 3-star, and whatever a 3-star admiral is, vice admiral from the Navy. Yeah. But that's a huge part of Redstone's operation right now.
Okay, and one thing, there's the missile defense, and it's MISIC.
Right.
Remind me what that is.
The Missile and Space Intelligence Center, which is operated by the Defense Intelligence Agency.
And we can't really, because you can't even drive on their parking lot.
That's to get on Redstone right now. Of course, takes an act of Congress. It's tough to get on Redstone right now. But if you work for them or the FBI, you have to go through. They have a whole different gate system.
Yeah.
To get into their facilities.
So anyway, so there's just so much has gone on, and if anything, what's happening at Redstone Arsenal is still expanding.
Yeah, and there's been talk about bringing the Space Command here.
Yeah, and I keep hearing that's a done deal, but it isn't here yet.
It isn't here yet. Yeah. But as we talked about it when we did part 1, the problem with, for lack of a better term, the problem with Redstone right now is we have a very limited amount of land that we can set up office buildings. And we are stretched very, very thin right now in terms of our, we had to shut down now Gate 8 because we're not enough people to man the gates.
Yeah.
And So that's a real big problem right now. And
It's and in the past, like during the Gulf War or after 9/11, security changed at Redstone Arsenal. It became and for a time, it was all the gates were manned by military personnel.
Well, no. Well, we had military personnel operating the gates in the 1960s, well, 50s and 60s.
It's kind of gone back and forth.
And then it went to mainly civilian gate guards. And then we had a commander who basically, if we have B-roll footage of Gate 9, there's just a little shack there in the middle of way down in Gate 9.
Yeah.
And a civilian guard would just occasionally go out and just kind of look at all the traffic coming in.
And the cars that you got in, you had a sticker on your bumper.
Well, yeah, and then moved from the bumper to the windshield.
Yeah, but it was a sticker. You just if you had a sticker, you got in.
And back in the 1990s, people were using Redstone as a cut through. People living in southeast Huntsville would use Redstone to cut through, and Channel 19 and all the media had to put out public service announcements that if you got caught without a sticker.
So I've driven through the not for decades, but I've driven through the Arsenal doing that, where it was a cut through, and the Arsenal has gone through so many changes and permutations, where things they do there, how the security of the base. At one point, I think I'm correct here, there were no gate guards per se, but each of the agencies, commands, whatever, provided their own security. They went through something like that at one time.
Had to provide their own security for their facilities. Yeah. But 9/11 changed all that.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't think we'll ever see, we had never seen anything like that. And for those who don't know, because we're coming up on 24 years since 9/11, for the first few months, you could have a badge, fine, but every single vehicle, you had to open up the hood of the car. You had to pop the trunk of your car. This is back before everybody had an SUV. They had mirrors underneath. They would look in your glove compartment.
They did that to the media too,
but
it was an interesting.
But
time.
It created lines. Traffic backed up on 565 going out towards Madison. Traffic was back. In fact, what's interesting? I want to back up a little bit. When we had the first Gulf War in 1990, we had put up a lot of gate guards again.
Yeah.
And they had opened up gates that had not been used since the 1950s and 60s.
And there are several gates not in use now, and in fact,
Buxton Road.
Yeah, there's a gate. I'm not going to say where it is. It's probably not. I'm not supposed to tell people that. But there are a couple of gates that are that I came in one time, and I didn't know there was a gate there. So there used to be a lot more entrances to Redstone Arsenal than there are now.
Oh yeah, a lot.
But
and a lot of them because they did not comply with the security requirements after 9/11. The Buxton Road gate is the most infamous example, because people talk about if you open up Buxton Road at the far south end, this is as you're coming up Memorial, you cross over the bridge, the Whitesburg Bridge, and where
it's where the old SCI plant used to be.
Right. And they've been talking about that for years to put up a 9/11 compliant gate there, because all these people coming in for what county is that? Morgan County?
Yeah, well, anybody coming across
from
that
the
direction
south,
across the Tennessee River would come in that way, and now they go, I guess.
Well, they have to go all the way up to Redstone Road.
Yeah.
And the Redstone Gate, and that gate is
So the base, and it's come a long way since it was two Redstone and Huntsville Arsenals, building munitions and being involved in various munition work during World War II?
You know, we talked about BRAC, and one of the BRACs we did not talk about, which was so important, was the BRAC 95. Because prior to BRAC 95, there was, as you said before, there was only two entities out there. Marshall Space Flight Center, well, three. Marshall Space Flight Center, MICOM, the Missile Command, and the Ordnance School, the Missile School. That was it. And every time a round of base closures were coming up, we were always nervous, you know, thinking, boy, you know, we may get shut down.
Every single military base is nervous before they do one of those.
And then there was a BRAC in the early 1990s where they were going to bring down, they were going to close up Rock Island Arsenal and bring down those people to Redstone. In fact, Mr. Jim Flynn, who I'm sure you, he was a deputy commander here, a civilian, did video promos for that to introduce people to the Tennessee Valley and where you could move to. And the Army Material Command in Washington, our parent command, was always slow on pushing the button on these. And that BRAC was canceled because there was a change in administration. Bill Clinton was elected in November of '92, and the senator for Illinois changed from Paul Simon to Carol Moseley Braun, and she put the kibosh on that BRAC. So BRAC 95 happens, and they want to close up the Army Aviation Command in St. Louis and move it to Redstone. That announcement came out in June of '95. Well, the Army Material Command learned their lesson, and they put that BRAC on overdrive. They closed up that BRAC and started moving people here so fast, and that command stood up what is now the Army Aviation and Missile Command.
And you know, I was sitting here thinking, we hadn't even talked about helicopters,
which is a huge part of the installation. But anyway, and our community was not ready for it. Because people didn't understand. We have never had a BRAC that bought a new mission to Redstone, and so it wasn't just the command, but it was
up till then.
But up until 95, 97 timeframe, it wasn't just bringing the command, but bringing what they call the Program Executive Officer, PEO Aviation, and all the contractor support for that. Thousands of people came in, and that really launched expansion. So like along Ziert Road, those developments along Ziert Road really blossomed up. And then what is now Hampton Cove, I know you remember this, but I'm sure a lot of the people listening to this don't remember this. Hampton Cove was, some developer said, I'm going to build these really nice, big, exclusive houses. What was considered, everybody thought, nobody's going to move to Hampton Cove because it's so far away from it.
And there was
Governor's Drive was a two-lane road.
I used to ride my bike in the Hampton Cove area in the early '80s, and when it was, you could look down, it was a hill and a lot of swampy land surrounding, a bottom land for farmers, and that's what was out there.
In fact, nobody called it Hampton Cove. Hampton Cove was just the name of a development. It was Owens Crossroads. And there was a lot of farmland. But that's took off when BRAC 95, bringing the aviation mission. We talk about, you were talking about earlier that people don't realize about that all the missiles and stuff that we provide to our foreign partners are managed from Redstone. Well, now every single Army aviation element is managed from Redstone. So systems developed that are very, very old now. But we're talking about the Chinook, the CH-47, which started development in 1958. We have the Black Hawk, which they started developing in the 1970s and was started being deployed in the late 70s, early 80s.
And has gotten a digital makeover.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Apache, the attack helicopter, which will replace the Cobra. And now something called Future Vertical Lift, the new generation of Army helicopters. All of that is being managed out of Redstone. So that mission, and the reason they bought the helicopters to Redstone is because for all those decades in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the TOW, which we developed here at Redstone, managed out of Redstone, but we were working with the Aviation Command in St. Louis to put the TOW onto a UE helicopter.
Yeah.
And in fact, we conducted the first live fire of a TOW on a UE helicopter in Vietnam. And then when we started developing the Hellfire missile, we started putting those onto initially Hueys and now onto Apaches.
And the Black Hawk replaced the Huey as
Black Hawk replaced the Huey. But yeah, that's one thing we didn't talk about. We're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of people in this community, not just on Redstone, but also off campus.
Yeah, it's like it is. We're thinking about it. It's just what Redstone does is just spread. It's like and we could probably talk for another day, but
and also what AMC continues to do.
Yeah,
AMC here at Redstone is continues to provide that support that.
You're talking about Army Material Command.
The Army Material
for every
Command.
soldier in the world who's is get all their needs are supplied by folks at Redstone Arsenal.
Right. So that huge Army logistical element, which we never saw before.
Yeah.
Again, back in the old days, we just had Missile Command, NASA, Missile School,
and one more thing: the unmanned aerial and ground things that we take for granted. Now, drones. Some of the earliest work on military applications for those was done at Redstone.
Right, via that aviation element that we have now.
So we're anyway. Okay, so if a NASA person is watching this, well, they're not talking about what NASA's doing, but that'll come. You're an Army guy.
Right.
So we're probably going to have to get a NASA historian up here to talk about Marshall Space Flight Center. But all the time, Redstone Arsenal is doing things. Marshall is building the Saturn V. Marshall is building the space shuttle, and the SLS. So there's
and one element that I can't talk about via NASA that gets left out. And it's in the news all the time. The International Space Station.
Yeah.
There is a very large building on Redstone, right across the street from where Von Braun and Medeiros worked.
Yeah.
That manages the International Space Station.
Yeah, the Payload Operations Center for every science experiment on the station is managed here.
Right, and whenever there's been a hurricane coming close to Houston, and they have to shut down Johnson Space Flight Center, we become the NASA Center of Operations during that time, and it's happened over the decades.
Such a Redstone Arsenal, and there's so much going on there. It's hard to keep for the average person to keep their arms around what goes on at Redstone. But
and that's one of the reasons, and one of the things that I can speak about, that's one of the reasons for every single employee at Redstone, when they get their security briefing, is told that we are a focus of international espionage in terms of the Chinese,
the FBI
Russians.
Office that used the FBI office when it was just an office off base. Industrial espionage was huge. It still is.
It still is. Yeah.
So with success and with all this work comes people trying to find out what you're doing and steal your secrets.
Yeah, but that's one of the first things you get briefed on is security, in terms of don't telling people on your social media account. Don't tell people where you work on Redstone. Don't tell people.
and there are buildings where you cannot carry where there's secure facilities. You cannot carry your telephone. You can't wear your iWatch, or you cannot carry any digital equipment with you when you go in the front door.
Right. You have to put them in lockers.
Yeah, for security reasons. So it's an important place with an incredible history. And Klaus, thank you.
No, thank you, Steve,
for being with us.
Always fun to talk about.
Well, we may do a part 3. We'll see.
Yeah, because we haven't even talked about. Well, in terms of a part 3 could be. First of all, there was a huge spy scandal on Redstone during the Medeiros time.
Okay, that's a tease. We'll get to the.
Also, with connecting dots. Everybody's been to who lives here has been to the Space and Rocket Center, but the story of the Space and Rocket Center.
Oh yeah.
Is
okay. So we can't talk any more about this. We're going to have to come. Okay, so you've already set up part 3.
That's part 3.
Spies
because
in the
spies, the Space and Rocket Center, and because that's a fascinating story.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Claus Martel, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you from Steve Johnson. Thank you for being with us on DigitalWorks TV, The Datazone. We're talking about Redstone history. This was part 2. Go back and check part 1 if you haven't already. In any case, thank you for being with us. And remember, it works.